So LCI has got the brightest minds to talk about the response to the coronavirus and how people are handling it, how libertarians are handling it. And so I've got Kevin Vallier, who is associate professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University. And Kevin, thanks for coming on to talk about the virus and our reactions to it.
Happy to. We're all kind of cooped up, so this is something easy and fun to take my mind off of things.
Yeah, well, you've been watching, you and I both have libertarian friends, and
Yeah.
we have seen multiple reactions, sort of a divide to some extent. And one thing I haven't seen is a lot of anarchists arguing for anarchism right now. I think the argument's a little bit different in libertarian world. Did coronavirus just help the minarchists win that argument?
I mean, Mike Humer had a blog post on this where he addressed it, but my take is, you have to distinguish between ideal and non-ideal theory. Anarchism may be the best thing, but you may think that people sort of mentally, culturally, are so far away from it that you have to work within the framework that exists. And so what the anarchists can say is, look, I think, there are ways an anarchist society could deal with these problems if we had it, where, there may be sort of culturally recognized coordinating mechanisms or certain kinds of insurance that would lead insurance companies to engage in certain kinds of actions, or private protection agencies would engage in quarantines themselves based on better data and more cheaply. You could say all of those things if you wanted. So I think what you have to say is, well, anarchist does have to concede, like, well, we probably do need some central coordination, given that everyone's expecting it.
Okay.
If just because the results will be worse, given that everyone's kind of reliant on the state. So there's been, I think anarchists get better at saying which state functions are less pernicious than others, and when it makes sense for the state to act, even if it's unjust, ultimately when it does. So I would just say, as long as the anarchists are saying, look, if we have anarchy, we should try to get to anarchy. It's desirable. We can solve certain kinds of problems with anarchy that we can under the state better. But for now, given what everyone's expecting, given that almost everybody's a statist, there's certain constraints that those attitudes bring.
Yeah. What would have been your observations about the libertarian reactions to it?
Well, it's been bimodal. You have a variety of people who are following the scientists and accepting what they say, which is kind of the more side that I'm on. But particularly when Tyler Cowen, Robin Hanson, and Matt Ridley all get worried about something being bad,
Yeah.
that makes me worried, because I consider the three of them, give the most level-headed, like pure rationalist, kind of
Yeah.
out there. So they're the ones who kind of got me freaked out, and a lot of them have focused on pandemics and thinking about the long-term sort of patterns of human civilization. And, they found repeatedly that pandemics are the big ones, right? And I've been studying a little bit about the history of the Byzantine Empire, and so I've come through the plague of Justinian, which, people don't know about because it happened hundreds of years before the Black Plague, and we don't have a collective memory of the Byzantine Empire, what it was going through. So people will have heard of Justinian through, say, the Justinian Code and the law, and they would know of Emperor Justinian. But, you had a massive, massive plague that fundamentally changed the course of European and Middle Eastern history. And then you have the Black Death, and then, of course, you have the Spanish flu. These are things that really knock off a lot of human beings and set things way, way back. So there's the one side that's thinking in those kind of big, broad civilizational terms, saying, look, we better err on the side of extreme caution, because these things are often a complete disaster, civilizational catastrophe, lead to the downfall of certain kinds of societies. So that's the one side. The other side is, I think, thinking more in terms of, well, the costs here are very, very large. The economic costs of restrictions are very, very large. And the moral costs are also very large, in the sense of allowing the state more power that it may never give back. And so a lot of people on the other side, I think, are in a position where they desire to reject the policies that are being proposed, and that's leading them to be more skeptical about the science. So I actually think, and maybe this isn't totally fair to that side, that they're kind of conclusion driven in their reasoning. They want to say, well, state bad, and so they say coronavirus not so bad. And I think that's a big mistake. And I sort of very much with the Ridley sort of Cowan Hansen attitude that we're looking for civilizational flourishing. Libertarians care about that, but that sometimes a big disaster happens. We've all got to coordinate, and it's difficult. And same thing with like a meteor strike, something like that.
Yeah. Do you think there's one of the people that as soon as I saw an article that Matt Ridley was taking it seriously, I was like, oh, this isn't just, and this was about 2 weeks ago. I mean, we're recording this on March 24th, 2020. Yeah. This was 2 weeks ago. Matt Ridley wrote an article, and I'm like, oh, okay, that gave me pause. And then Tyler Cowen, and like these are people who are relatively optimistic, and they relatively, they're libertarian in a very broad sense and even very important senses. So yeah, I mean, maybe there's room to think here that like, all right, maybe this time around the government's going to get a little bit more leeway than it ought to. But if we look back 100 years from now and say, yes, but we knew that it overstepped, like maybe there's like steps we can take now that's like, all right, this is going to get worse a little bit, but we're going to use this as a lesson to help us learn to get better. Just like right now, there's no like right response to the virus and the pandemic itself. And we're going to learn like, okay, we overreacted. Let's not do that next time.
Yeah, we don't have probabilities. So this is a situation where we're under what's been called, Austrians, but also Frank Knight called uncertainty rather than risk. Uncertainty is when you know some outcomes, but you don't know the probabilities of those outcomes. And I think libertarians, our best value added has been pushing for deregulation on behalf of experimentation. I think we're not going to stop. It's going to be very hard to stop any kind of big ratcheting up by government, just like there is in a war. The hope is that with enough, the best way we limit the state is by pushing and demanding on experiments for cures, because the sooner we get the cure first, that will improve human well-being dramatically. But second, it will also undermine the rationale for the expansion of the state. This is one reason, a lot of my work on trust, I think, bears on how libertarians think about things. I mean, if there had been kind of more trust in certain kinds of public health institutions, maybe we would have gotten a handle on this thing sooner. And maybe it would have been easier to direct us in the way that South Koreans accepted direction, such that their state doesn't have to dramatically expand much at all. So I think, we libertarians need to learn to be more discerning, to say, well, we better push for this part of government to be good and strong, because if it falls, then this other part of government is going to get huge. Like we're going to start seeing the military doing stuff, building off, all kinds of different things. So my thought is, libertarians need one thing to learn from this. Libertarians need to get more discerning about the interconnections between the parts of the state and the way in which if one fails, the other expands. We've got to be more careful.
Yeah, so more discerning is probably good. Well, how do you personally digest the onslaught of information? I mean, right now we don't have a state-controlled media. I know, we might chuckle at whether or not we do here, but we have social media. It's not shut down. We have freedom in a lot of ways to connect with people, and yet there's just so much information, and most of us aren't epidemiologists, and most of us aren't economists, and like maybe 3 people out there are both.
Yep.
And they're not telling us anything.
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, what I want to say about that is that typically my attitude to scientists is that they know their field, and then when they offer recommendations about institutions, they tend to be kind of centralist socialist types, because that's what they do in their lives. They, organize materials. They kind of have an engineering perspective to all of life. You organize things, you get all the pieces of the system in place and make sure that it works. So, when they say, look, here's what we think the infection patterns are going to be, then I believe them. And if some libertarian posts one guy who disagrees, then I just say, okay, one expert disagrees, 99 experts agree. My credence is going to be 99%.
Yeah.
But then
more on the other side. Yeah.
Yeah. So just weigh up the expert judgments and judgment aggregators. I pay a lot of attention to those. But then when they start to say, oh, we need this or that policy, I start to get skeptical. I'm with the market monetarists like Scott Sumner in thinking that the Fed can basically do everything that we would want it to do. Compared to having fiscal policy, I think that the Fed has enough flexibility with respect to liquidity that we don't need fiscal stimulus. The Fed should just compensate. Now, I know, many libertarians are like, well, that will make things worse. But hey, Fed stimulus is better than the federal government stimulus, right? It's going to be way less wasteful. It's much more quick. It's less distortionary, right?
Do you think the Fed has more local knowledge, like Hayek is as important?
They can look at it in terms of the local Fed banks. But it's also just the case that look, here's our option set right now. Is the Fed going to do most of the stimulus, or is the government going to do most of the stimulus? Or are they going to break even, right? And I think libertarians should all want the Fed because they're going to distort the market less. They're going to be less coercive. It's going to take, fewer taxes to get rid of the problem, if any.
Easier.
Yes, it might. Yeah, it might distend the capital structure here and there, but really those are our choices. We're not going to have no stimulus. And indeed, pretty much all Austrians, with the exception of Rothbard and a few people, think that the Fed screwed up and caused a Great Depression because they let the monetary base collapse. So there's better and worse things the Fed could be doing. And the best for it to do, I think, is for it to ensure that there's enough money in circulation so that things don't collapse. Now, of course, Misesians will say, yeah, but don't you think like prices will adjust and like the monetary supply would be self-equilibrating, and if it creates a lot more money, it's just going to reduce its value. But those effects are slower than what we would need to be right now. The Fed can get the money out there, and yes, later on it can screw some things up. I'm no doubt it'll send some bad signals.
Yeah.
But those effects of the money, like what Mises talks about of it adjusting, I don't know how fast those effects are, and we're looking at day by day.
You think that the effects are going to be a little less business cycle-y? That's a terrible way to say it because I can't come up with words in my mouth right now. The question I have is, do you think that it'll be less that because actually people are getting money? It's not just the banks. Like, it's not infusing it at the top; it's infusing it everywhere.
I think that will help. Cash is better than in-kind benefits most of the time. The hard thing is just figuring out. Well, let's put it this way. It doesn't look like the recession is caused by an underlying weakness in the economy, and so it'll be less recession-y, less business cycle-esque. Because it's not based on an underlying problem, like in the capital. I mean, 2008, you've got an underlying problem in the.
It wasn't a market problem that caused a market failure.
Yeah, and in this case, look, wealth's just being destroyed, so of course the stock market's going to fall, right? Like, it's not exchanging as much. Like it was never going to not be bad. So it's a supply shock and a demand shock at the same time. People have less money to buy stuff, but also fewer people can supply things. So we're always going to this was always going to be horrible if it happened. And the question is, what's the best way to let things to get poorer? And essentially, what's the best way to get poorer?
So what sort of signs of hope do you have?
Well, just following everything, I'm excited about how much innovation seems to be going on, all the different ideas that scientists across the world are having. Looks like Italy may have lowered the increase in the death rate. So some evidence that social distancing is working even there, maybe. I do think the Fed has made the best decision it can in terms of being prepared to keep doing whatever is possible to keep the monetary base from collapsing. I think that will prevent wealth from being destroyed in the very short term. But wealth is going to be destroyed. I'm also following a lot of the predictions, and it's looking to me like we're not going to lose 1 million people in the country. It looks pretty unlikely at this point. The hope is that but it looks like the judgment aggregators that we've seen are still predicting around 200,000 deaths within a year, which is, all the war deaths since the end of World War II combined, like Vietnam, Korea, both Iraqs, you add them all up, I think it's about 130, 150,000. I was doing some back of the envelope math yesterday. So it is the greatest, direct event where there's a loss of life. Now, of course, there's all kinds of things that kill people all the time, but we still care about our war dead.
Yeah.
Like, these are salient events to which institutions need to respond. People are always going to die of old age and cancer and heart disease, and that's just part of life. But this is different. So we just have to figure out the best way to allow wealth to disappear, and the most freedom way. The value added that libertarians can have right now is insisting on experimentation and innovation. And I also think the fiscal package they're about to pass. I mean, Scott Sumner says, the Fed's still just scratching the surface of its policy flexibility. So I wonder if there's not some tool they have that would make it easier for people who need the money to get it. I don't know. I just know it. I got a student who's an undergrad who's working at the New York Fed right now, and he says there's just so much going on, and people having so many guesses about what to do, and different policy ideas. It's forcing people to be creative, but hopefully not in a way that's terrible. So my goal is we need to find a way to be let down easy. Libertarians need to be focused on innovation, and hopefully keeping the federal government from getting any more powerful than it needs to be.
Yeah. Thanks for talking with us about this. I hope you're right that we can encourage innovation, experimentation, and reduce the long-term loss of liberties if there are any. So thanks, man. I appreciate you talking.
Yep.